Smell that? That smells like placeholder graphics here in the inky void of Final Fantasy maps, which must mean it's time for another Villainous Final Fantasy deck. And today on the docket we have Final Fantasy VI's main villain, Kefka. Now, I actually loathe this deck. I hate playing it. And there have been many times over the course of playtesting and balancing and whatnot that I've just thought about scrapping the deck entirely. It has characteristics that make it very unique, but the characteristics that make it unique also make it... I mean, you'll see as I describe the deck. First of all, though, some new features that we have for all decks is each of the decks now has a little mover instead of having just a plain old Parcheesi pawn. And I've also added these action symbol cheat sheets for each villain. So on the front of the cheat sheet, it displays all the action symbols and what they do. And then on the back, it has an inventory of your villain's deck. So you know which cards you have and how many of each. So let's talk about Kefka then. Here is Kefka's realm. His objective is play Light of Judgment when all 6 Magicite shards are in the same discard pile. Kefka has 2 major differences from other villains. As we go through his villain guide here, you'll see what those are. So the objective, as I've said, is to get these Magicite shards into a discard pile. There are 6 of them in the deck, and once all of them are in the same discard pile, Kefka can play a card called Light of Judgment to win the game. The first major difference of Kefka's deck is that he actually has 2 villain decks and 2 discard piles that he has to manage. So to set those up, there are some setup rules for him. You set aside the Magicite cards, you shuffle the remaining cards, you then split those into 2 decks, put 3 shards into each deck, shuffle the 2 decks individually. You end up with 2 villain decks, each with 3 Magicite shards inside, and Kefka needs to find all 6 before he can win. When Kefka draws on his turn, he's allowed to draw from either of his villain decks or both if he wants. He can take 1 card from each if he needs to draw 2 cards, for example. If he wants to draw from an empty villain deck, he just has to shuffle the closest discard pile to make a new villain deck. So that's a pretty standard rule in Villainous. If you want to draw from your deck but there's nothing in it, shuffle your discard pile to make a new deck. When Kefka wants to discard, though, he has to discard into his 2 discard piles in an alternating fashion. First one, then the other. So I give an actual detailed example here in his villain guide to show how that works. The reason for this is because all 6 of his Magicite shards have to be in the same discard pile, and there's actually a bit of strategy in working around the game state when you're holding, say, 2 Magicite shards and they need to go into 1 discard pile, but that particular discard pile is locked down because it's the one you most recently discarded to. This actually takes a bit of getting used to when you play the Kefka deck, but it's pretty easy to keep track of. You discard a card, you put a token on that discard pile, and then next time you discard a card, you know where that card needs to go. It goes to the pile without a token. So you discard a card to that pile, then move the token over to that pile. The other major difference to Kefka's deck is that almost the entire deck is built out of conditions. Conditions are special cards in Villainous that get played on other players' turns. A condition always has a trigger and then an effect. For example, a trigger might be on another player's turn when they have 6 or more power. You can play this card and gain 3 power. Every villain in the base Disney Villainous games has exactly 2 conditions and has exactly 2 copies of each of those 2 conditions. So building a deck around conditions entirely completely breaks the spirit of the game, breaks the balance of the game, breaks every single rule the game has, and makes the deck basically unplayable and worthless. So let's go through the deck and see what's actually in it. Starting out, we have the 6 Magicite shards. These shards are all identical except for their artwork. Here we have Shiva, Ifrit, Madween, Carbuncle, Unicorn, and Phantom. The Magicite shards have a cost of infinity to make sure that you never ever play them. To win the game, you've got to find these 6 cards somewhere in your 2 villain decks, put all 6 of them into the same discard pile, and then play a particular condition card to win the game. So most of Kefka's cards are conditions, but some of them are not. For example, he has 2 of these cranes. Kefka really has to deal with heroes that hit his realm. A lot of villains can just let the heroes build up or ignore them if they're in a particular place, but Kefka really has to deal with them. So the crane is useful for moving heroes to a place where they're going to be out of his way until he can sufficiently deal with them. To that end, we have the Slave Crown. This is probably the most powerful card in Kefka's deck when it comes to heroes. It basically turns a hero into an ally. This actually turns out to be better than defeating them, because defeating them puts them back into the Fate deck where they can be drawn again. If you don't have a Slave Crown, you might have a Peace Ring. This doesn't defeat a hero, but it does at least ignore special abilities the hero has, and the special abilities are what makes heroes really dangerous in this deck. The most useful item outside of heroes that Kefka has is probably World of Ruin. This puts another discard button on Kefka's space. In fact, I just realized that I have not flipped the realm back over from when the game crashed and I had to put in a jump cut in the video. How unprofessional of me. Kefka has 2 discard buttons on his realm. He has one at the Blackjack that he always has access to, and he has one at Nourish that can be covered with heroes. But for reasons that we'll see, it's actually important that Kefka have the ability to put a 3rd discard button in his realm if he needs it. And then Kefka's got a few allies. He has Emperor Gestalt here. Emperor Gestalt is not useful for taking out heroes, but he can help get Magicite shards into your hand and then into your discard pile. Then we have Ultros. Ultros is actually pretty good at defeating heroes because you can never defeat Ultros. He always comes back. So when Ultros defeats a hero, you put him back on top of one of your villain decks if you want to, or you can just discard him as normal. It's up to you. And then we have the Warring Triad. Warring Triad's strength is equal to Kefka's total power, and that's actually pretty strong because this is the last card in Kefka's deck that he actually needs to spend power on. So this is potentially a very powerful ally if you can get it out early and move it into place to remove a pesky hero that's keeping you from winning the game. Kefka does have 2 more allies. He has Biggs and Wedge, but these are special allies. These are condition allies. Biggs gets played whenever on another player's turn they play an ally. Wedge gets played when on another player's turn they play an item. They both have the same ability. They get +2 strength if the other is in the realm. These are just general grunts that Kefka can get out on the board kind of surprisingly. And now we're going to walk through all of Kefka's wacky conditions that he has. So, during their turn, if another player gains power, Kefka can play and gain as much power as they did. Kefka doesn't typically use power to play cards. Instead, he uses it to activate abilities on cards or to power up the Warring Triad. We have The End is Near. Depending on what other villains you're playing against, certain condition triggers are actually harder to meet than others, and Kefka needs to access his conditions more than other villains do. So he has The End draws near in order to help him play a condition, even if that condition's trigger might not pop up. We have Do I Look Like a Waiter? This is really useful because Kefka can always play this. Players on their turn always have to move, unless they're playing Ultimecia, I guess. If Kefka's in a location and he wants to take the actions in that location next turn, he can play Do I Look Like a Waiter, move somewhere else, then when his turn comes back around, move back to the original location that he wants to be at. Very sneaky, very tricky, and very useful. Osmos is probably the funniest card I've ever designed. Another player plays a condition, you play Osmos, you gain 1 power, and that player's condition does not occur. Typically, Villainous cards can't target other players in this way unless it's their Fate deck doing it, but I really think making an exception for Kefka is in character, and the deck is already broken as it is, so I wasn't really worried about breaking it more. We have Nihilism. On another player's turn, when they perform a discard action, you can perform a discard action. And then we get Or You'll Be Well Done. When another player performs move hero action, you perform move hero action. We have Is the Poison Ready? This is one of Kefka's most powerful cards. If another player has more power than you do on their turn, you play this card. You can reveal up to 3 conditions from your discard pile, conditions that you've already played this game, and then put all of them in your hand. The trade-off of this card is it's actually kind of difficult for Kefka to have less power than another villain. You almost have to go out of your way to shed power to be able to use this, but if you can, and you get 3 conditions you've already played back into your hand, that's a lot of extra actions Kefka could potentially take. We have Dancing Mad. This one allows you to take your hand, put it on top of your villain deck, and draw that many cards from your other villain deck. This is useful if you think you've seen all the Magicite shards in one deck and want to quickly get a bunch of cards out of the other deck. We have Enjoy the Barbecue. This is just a pretty standard, when another player defeats a hero, you can defeat a hero. Lots of villains have this same card. I figured Kefka might need it too. We have Center of the Triad. This gives Kefka a little bit of control over his own Fate deck. Kefka has one of the worst Fate decks that I've designed, so giving him this option to kind of go in there, take a look, and shuffle things around, or at least know what's coming up, is pretty imperative to winning as Kefka. We have a little Magicite Mayhem. This lets you pull Magicite shards out of your villain decks and put them in your hand, or if you look in your villain deck and see there are no Magicite shards, you can take any card and put it in your hand. The idea being that other players at the table won't know whether you've taken a Magicite shard or something else. And then we have Sneeze. When another player performs an activate, you take a hero from your realm, put them back on the Fate deck. Chances are that hero is coming right back out, but it buys you a little bit of breathing room at least. Then we have Heartless Angel. When another player plays an effect, you play this. All heroes in your realm have a strength of 1 until the end of your upcoming turn. This just helps you defeat heroes that are out if you have no other option than to use your allies. And then the final card in Kefka's deck, which is also a condition. During their turn, when another player takes any action other than a Fate action, you can play this card. When you play it, all the Magicite shards are in the same discard pile. You win the game. Funny story, the very first version of this card read something like, when another player would win the game, you can play this card, and then you win instead. That obviously led to eternal stalemates, and Kefka was absolutely unplayable. It does specify other than a Fate action, that way other players, if they think Kefka is about to win, they can at least Fate him without immediately giving him the game. And his Fate deck does have the opportunity to push him back some. Let's take a look. First we have the heroes that he has to deal with. Oh, I'm sorry. First he has Soul of Thamasa. This card is imperative in defeating Kefka. Basically, if you see this in a Fate action, you can take another, better Fate action, reveal the top 3 cards of Kefka's Fate deck, and play one immediately. Lots of cards in Kefka's Fate deck can ruin his day, but the balancing act here is because Kefka's discard piles are face down and other players are not allowed to look at them, and because other players never see his Magicite shards and actually don't know where they are, it's impossible to know how close Kefka is to winning, unless he tells you, and he might be lying. So having this one card in his Fate deck that allows you to target specific Fate at him leads to a lot of mind games, both on Kefka's behalf and on his opponents. Now let's take a look at his heroes. First we have Terra. Terra is awful because if she's out, Kefka can only throw 1 card away per turn when he performs a discard action. And remember, he wants to put Magicite shards in only one deck, and he has to alternate the 2 discard piles. If Terra's on the board, he can at best throw away 1 Magicite shard every 2 turns. We then have Locke. Locke is here to take Kefka's very useful items away. For example, if he's got a Slave Crown to turn the hero into an ally, Locke can come out, steal the Slave Crown, and then the hero goes back into play. We then have Edgar. Edgar can be played to, say, Narsh, to cover up the discard button in Narsh, and then Edgar's special ability allows you to pick 1 other action symbol in Kefka's realm that he also covers. I've seen this Kefka deck played, I don't know, 20 or 30 times now. I don't think I've ever seen Edgar not played to Narsh and then immediately cover up this discard button here. And that's really why Kefka needs that World of Ruin card. If he can't take care of Edgar, he needs some other way to discard. We have Celeste. Celeste is Kefka's hard stop. He can't play conditions while Celeste is on the board. We have General Leo. He's just a decent bruiser with 6 power. And you can't Slave Crown him. I guess you could Slave Crown him if you Peace Ringed him first. But man, that's a lot of resources to put on one guy. Then we have Realm. Realm is potentially disastrous to Kefka. You can put her in a location, and then if Kefka moves there, he has to immediately draw a card and then discard it. Kefka knows which one of his decks his Magicite shards are going into, and he knows which discard pile he has to discard to next. So if you watch a Kefka player willingly move to a location with Realm and blindly draw and then discard a card, Kefka's kind of giving away a little too much information there. A smart Kefka player would never do this because you might accidentally put a Magicite shard into the wrong pile. So if you see a Kefka player doing this, it must mean that they know that the pile they're discarding to is not the pile with the Magicite shards in it. If Kefka ever reveals that information to the other players, he's basically lost the game, as we will see. The final hero is Gogo. Gogo, the Mimic, just chases Kefka around the board. A previous version of this card said that Gogo could only be played to the realm if another hero was there, and then Gogo took on the special abilities of another hero already in the realm. That was extremely complicated. It was also extremely powerful. You basically got 2 chances to get Celeste on the board, which is his hard stop. It put Kefka into a permanently locked state with Edgar, though, because you could play Edgar, lock the discard, then play Gogo and lock his other discard, and by that point, Kefka could get into a state, if Celeste was also on the board, where he couldn't play conditions, his hand is full of conditions, he can't discard, he can't do anything, and you really can't have a deck in that state. There always has to be at least one way out of a losing state. So I simplified Gogo, now he just chases you around. Here we have Searching for Friends, and this is one of the reasons Kefka's Fate deck is so bad. There are 2 of these in here. Even after he defeats a hero, Searching for Friends can bring them right back out. Playing Kefka, you can guarantee you're going to see Celeste come out on the board at least twice because of this card. We have here Sand on My Boots. This takes 2 cards from each of Kefka's discard piles and puts them on top of one of Kefka's villain deck. This card can never ruin him because it's taking cards out of the discard and putting them back in the villain deck. Kefka can just go ahead and draw those and discard them again. This is a way to push him back a few inches but not actually ruin his life. To ruin his life, you've got to play World of Balance. This puts a lock token on one of Kefka's villain decks, and then he can't draw from that deck until he shuffles the associated discard pile into it. If you lock a deck that still has Magicite shards in it, and the nearest discard to that deck also has Magicite shards in it, Kefka has to start over. If you lock a deck and you think the Magicite shards are in the other discard pile, you can then play one of the 2 Confuse cards, which gives you the option of swapping the position of his 2 discard piles. The combo of Confuse and World of Balance can really wreck Kefka's day if he's not being careful. There are play strategies that I've developed to get around that particular combo, but I'm not going to reveal them in this video because I think it would be hilarious if people play this deck and get caught in it. But like I said, I absolutely abhor playing this deck. I cannot stand it. Some of my playtesters really like it, and the deck has a decent win-loss rate, and I had to really force myself to release it into the public Steam page because I just have to admit I'll never know if this particular deck is balanced properly. It has this characteristic where if you're playing as Kefka, because nobody else knows how close or far you are from your win condition, the amount of fate you receive does not correlate with how close or far you are from your win condition. That's very different from other villains, and it can lead to some really crushing Kefka losses where you just never had a chance and an avalanche of fate just falls all over you. But then the flip side is also true. Sometimes Kefka gets everything lined up right, and if people lay off the Fate just a little bit, he sneaks out a win before anybody else knows what happened. And in those games, it really feels like Kefka is OP and there's no way to beat him. I think this is all very much in character for Kefka. The deck is just going to have to stand on its own. I'm pretty sure there's no more hard locks in the deck. It's not going to lead to eternal stalemates anymore. Some of my playtesters, like I said, really enjoy this deck. I personally hope to never play it again, and it's out there now, and you can play with it. The link is in the doobly-doo. Enjoy Final Fantasy Villainous. Thanks for watching. See you next time.